All right, so you're back with us for another deep dive. And, today we're really going to tackle something that's, I think, pretty woven into all of our lives these days.
Yeah.
The impact of social media on human behavior. And it really is. I mean, just thinking about it, it's multifaceted. There's so many layers to this. And
yeah, it's a huge topic.
it is.
And it's something that affects us every single day.
It does, even if we don't realize it right. And that's kind of part of what we want to dig into today.
Absolutely.
We've got a really great article that we're going to be using as kind of the springboard for this conversation today. And it's actually designed for people who are learning English as a second language. So it's really interesting because not only does it analyze this whole topic of social media and human behavior, but it's also
kind of the language to talk about.
Exactly. It's got vocab.
Yeah.
It's got some phrases that are really useful.
And real world examples
Exactly.
of how people are using the language.
Super practical.
We're going to discuss this. Yeah.
So we're going to be pulling from that today, but we're going to be really kind of, I think, going beyond just like the words themselves and really thinking about what are the core insights here about how social media shapes us.
How it shapes the way we behave.
Right. And sometimes it's subtle, but sometimes, let's face it, it's not.
No, it's not. Yeah. Sometimes it's pretty blatant.
It's pretty in your face.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I wanted to start by asking you, like, as you're listening, have you ever just stopped to think about how these platforms really influence your daily life? Like how they kind of nudge you in certain directions or maybe even shove you?
Yeah, it's a great question to start with. And I think before we can even understand the impact of social media on human behavior, we kind of need to think about the baseline,
Right.
What is human behavior to begin with?
Yeah.
Traditionally, we understand human behavior as kind of all of our actions and mannerisms and how we respond to different stimuli and interactions in our environment, Think about it, like how your culture shapes how you behave,
Absolutely.
how your past experiences, influence how you react to certain things.
Yes.
Your emotions play a huge role.
Yeah.
And of course, all the social influences around you.
All the time.
All the time, right?
So how does that then translate to the online world?
Right. So when we think about the online world and human behavior, we kind of have to add some new layers to it,
Yeah.
It's about how we choose to present ourselves online.
Okay.
That digital persona we cultivate.
Right.
It's about all the different ways we interact with others through comments and likes and shares and direct messages. And perhaps most importantly, it's about how the massive amount of content that we consume actually shapes our mood, our thoughts, and even the choices we make in our lives.
Okay, so there's that kind of like input and output almost.
Right, exactly.
Like how it's coming at us and then how we're putting ourselves out there.
Yeah.
And both of those things are sort of
They're in constant
intertwined and influencing us.
Yeah, a constant loop.
So the article gives us some really basic vocabulary right off the bat.
Yeah, it does.
And it's useful to sort of, I think, start with those, those foundational terms. So we're talking about things like stimuli. So stimuli are things that trigger a reaction. And the example it gives is bright colors in an advertisement act has stimuli to grab your attention.
Yeah.
But when we think about social media, those stimuli could be...
Oh, they could be anything.
Like so many things it could be.
A picture, a headline, something your friend posted about.
Like an event they went to.
Their vacation photo.
Anything, right?
Yeah.
And then that kind of like sparks a reaction in us, whether it's to click on it or leave a comment, or just even to feel something different.
Exactly, a shift in your mood even.
Yeah, like, oh, I wish I was there, or...
Yeah, or I'm so happy for them.
I'm so jealous, right?
Exactly.
And then there's the word mannerism. So mannerism is basically just a way of behaving that's kind of typical for you. And it's interesting to think about like our online mannerisms.
Yeah.
How we
present ourselves.
Yeah, and like what we do online versus what we might do in person.
Totally.
Right? Do they match up or are they different?
Right. Are you more bold online or are you more, shy and reserved?
Or maybe you use different emojis or,
Yeah, exactly.
You abbreviate things more in your writing style.
Right.
And then there's the word perception.
Yeah.
Which is just how something is understood or interpreted. And the article brings up a really interesting point that social media can actually distort our perception of what is real
Yeah.
or normal. When you think about all those like perfectly filtered vacation photos
Right.
or the really positive life updates that people are constantly sharing.
It's like everyone's living their best life all the time.
Yeah, it's like, is this real life, or is this
Right.
a very curated,
A very specific version of reality.
right? Yeah. And then the last kind of like foundational vocab word is influence, which we all know what influence means. It's the ability to have an effect on someone or something.
Right.
And the article makes the point that online personalities or influencers have a huge influence, particularly on younger people.
Especially on younger people.
And it's like, okay, so we've got these kind of like four pieces,
Yeah.
stimuli, mannerism, perception, influence, and they're all
intertwined.
they're all feeding into each other.
Yeah.
And that's what we're going to like really
unpack
as we go deeper into this.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the article then introduces this really interesting conversation between two people,
Right.
Alex and Mia. And Alex starts out by asking, like, do you think people are really themselves online?
Mm-hmm.
And Mia's response, I think, is really interesting. She's
Yeah.
like, not always. A lot of people just create like a curated version of their life.
Yeah, just the highlights.
Yeah. And Alex is like, yeah, I feel that pressure
Yeah.
to only show the good moments.
Right.
And I feel like that's something that we can all probably relate to, right?
Oh, absolutely.
I know I can.
Like, have you ever felt like that where you're like, okay, I'm only going to share the stuff that makes me look good, or,
Yeah, for sure. Or like you're trying to
That's such a great time.
create a certain image of yourself that
Yeah.
you want people to see.
And then Mia brings up this term impression management,
Right.
which is basically like how we try to control how other people see us.
It's like we're all putting on a performance.
It's a performance.
In a way.
And social media is just like this stage.
Absolutely. It's a global stage.
Yeah, where you can perform for anyone who wants to watch.
Exactly.
And Mia makes a really important point that this whole like carefully constructed presentation,
Yeah.
this pressure to always be highlighting the positive can actually affect your self-esteem in the long run.
Right.
Because if you're always comparing your like normal everyday life
Yeah, to everyone else's highlight reel.
to everyone else's highlight reel, you're going to start to feel bad about yourself.
For sure. Yeah. So this leads really nicely into like the next part of the article, which is
Yeah.
about the psychological effects
Yeah.
of social media. And it starts by talking about this idea of social comparison, which is something that as humans we do naturally.
Right. We're social creatures.
Yeah, we're always comparing ourselves to other people.
It's how we figure out, where we stand.
Right. Are we doing okay?
Exactly.
Are we successful?
Yeah.
But social media kind of puts this like magnifying glass on it.
It does. It amplifies it.
And it's not even accurate information a lot of times, right?
Right. Because what we're seeing is, like you're saying, the most polished, the most exciting, often completely unrealistic version of people's lives.
Right.
Yeah.
So we're comparing ourselves to something that's not even real.
Yeah. It sets up this really unfair comparison.
Yeah. So it's no wonder that a lot of people end up feeling like, envious or inadequate.
Right. And the article defines envy as this feeling of discontent or resentful longing for someone else's possessions or qualities.
Like you're wishing you had what they had.
Yeah, exactly.
And it gives this really interesting example. It says, scrolling through travel photos triggered envy in her heart.
Oh, yeah. I've definitely been there.
Haven't we all?
Yeah. Scrolling through Instagram and seeing everyone's amazing vacations.
Yeah. And you're like, I'm stuck here at work,
Yeah. Stuck at home.
Right. And then that can lead to like this distorted sense of self-worth.
Right.
So
Yeah.
distorted meaning like twisted out of shape or meaning.
Yeah. Kind of warped out of whack.
Out of whack.
Yeah.
And the example it gives is his view of success became distorted by influencers.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like we're getting this
Unrealistic
idea of what it means to be successful.
Yeah. Because what we see online isn't necessarily
A fair picture.
a full picture of what it takes to achieve that.
Yeah. And it could make us feel like we're just not measuring up.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
The article also talks about addictive behaviors,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is something that,
Oh, yeah. A lot of people can relate to.
yeah, a lot of us have probably experienced this in some way or another.
For sure.
And there's this little conversation between Liam and Sarah.
Right.
And they're talking about like just constantly checking their phone.
Yeah. Liam was saying he checks his phone like every 5 minutes.
Yeah. It's almost like involuntary.
Yeah. He's like, I can't even help it.
And Sarah brings up this concept of dopamine loops,
Right.
which is really fascinating.
It is. It's kind of like the science behind why we get so hooked on social media.
So explain that a little bit more.
So dopamine is this neurotransmitter in our brain that's associated with pleasure and reward,
Okay.
And when we get those little notifications, those likes, those comments, those new followers, our brain releases a little bit of dopamine and it makes us feel good.
So it's like a reward.
It's a reward.
Yeah.
So we keep going back for more.
Exactly. And the thing is with social media, those rewards are unpredictable.
Right. You don't know when you're going to get them.
You don't know when you're going to get that next, or that next comment.
So it kind of keeps us hooked.
It's like gambling almost.
It is. It's very similar to gambling.
Like a slot machine.
You don't win every time, but
But you might.
you might.
Right.
Yeah.
So you just keep pulling that lever.
Exactly.
So have you ever like caught yourself reaching for your phone
Oh, all the time?
without even really knowing why?
Yeah, like I don't even know what I'm looking for.
Yeah, like what am I doing?
But I just got to check.
I just got to check.
Yeah.
And then there's these other two things that the article talks about that I think are so relevant to like how we live in the world today.
Yeah.
Which are echo chambers and polarization.
Yeah.
And the way the article defines an echo chamber, it says it's an environment where a person only encounters information or opinions that reflect and reinforce their own.
Right. So they're basically just surrounded by people who agree with you.
Yeah, and it gives this example. It says, living in an echo chamber can narrow your understanding of the world. And a big part of why this happens is because of the algorithms that these social media platforms use.
Right.
Which, they're designed to keep us engaged.
Yeah, to keep us scrolling.
But the way they do that is by showing us more of what we've already liked or interacted with in the past.
Right. So it creates this very personalized feed.
Right.
Where you're only seeing things that you already agree with.
Yeah, it's like a filter bubble.
A filter bubble, yeah.
And over time, that can lead to polarization.
Yeah.
Which the article defines as basically division into two sharply contrasting groups or opinions.
Right. Like everything's becoming more extreme.
Yeah, it's like us versus them.
Yeah.
And the example it gives is political polarization is rising due to social media bubbles, which I think we see that playing out all the time.
We see it everywhere. Yeah.
Right. It's like people are just becoming more and more entrenched in their own beliefs.
Right. And less willing to listen to opposing viewpoints.
Because they're not even seeing them.
They're not even seeing them, yeah.
So have you noticed that happening in your own social media feed?
Oh, yeah, definitely. It's hard to avoid.
It is. It is.
Yeah.
So the article then has this really helpful section called Vocabulary Booster.
Yeah.
Where it gives us some more advanced vocabulary that's related to all of this.
Yeah.
And I think it's really useful to just kind of like
Yeah, let's look at some of those words.
look at these words and think about how they apply to our own lives. So the first one is ubiquity,
Ubiquity.
which basically means being everywhere.
Yeah, it's like omnipresent.
Right.
Right.
And the example it gives is the ubiquity of smartphones means everyone is always connected. Yeah, and it's true. Right? Like, can you even remember a time before
It's hard to imagine.
we were all just like constantly connected?
It's like, what did we even do?
I don't know.
Yeah.
And then there's pervasive,
Pervasive.
which means spreading widely throughout an area or a group of people.
Yeah, like it's everywhere. You can't
Yeah.
escape it.
Right. And the example it gives is social media's influence is so pervasive, it affects even offline behavior.
That's a really interesting point.
It is, right?
It's not just when we're online, it affects how we behave.
Yeah. It affects how we think,
Yeah.
how we interact with each other,
Total.
even when we're not scrolling or posting or whatever.
All right. It's kind of seeped into everything.
It has.
Yeah.
The next word is exacerbate,
Exacerbate.
which means to make something worse.
Right.
And the example it gives is negative comments can exacerbate feelings of insecurity.
Oh, yeah. That's definitely true.
And that's something that unfortunately we see a lot of online.
Yeah, cyberbullying.
Yeah, all kinds of like
Trolling.
nasty
Yeah. that's
negativity, right?
Yeah.
And then we've already talked about authenticity.
Yeah, authenticity.
Just being real, being genuine.
Right, being true to yourself.
And the example it gives here is many users crave more authenticity from influencers.
Yeah. I think that's a trend we're seeing.
Yeah, I think people are kind of tired of the fake
The fakeness?
perfection.
Yeah.
They want something real.
They don't want to see the real person behind the
Yeah.
curated image.
The curated image, right?
Yeah.
And then the last word is anonymity,
Anonymity.
which is just the state of being anonymous, of not being known.
Right.
And the example it gives is anonymity online can lead to both freedom of expression and cyberbullying.
Which is interesting, right?
It's a double-edged sword.
The double-edged sword, yeah.
Because on the one hand, it can allow people to speak their minds,
Yeah.
maybe in ways that they wouldn't feel comfortable doing if they were using their real name.
Right.
But it can also lead to some really harmful behavior.
Yeah. People feel like they can say anything because
there are no consequences.
they're hidden behind a screen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting to think about like all those words and just like where they show up in our own lives.
Yeah. How they apply to our own experiences online.
So the article then moves on to talking about some real world examples of how social media is impacting human behavior. And one of the first things it brings up is the so-called TikTok generation.
Right.
And, this whole question of attention spans.
Yeah, it's a hot topic.
It is. And it mentions this study from 2023 that suggested that there's a link between frequently consuming short-form video content.
Yeah, like TikTok videos.
Yeah, like TikTok videos.
Yeah.
And having trouble focusing for longer periods of time.
Yeah, it's like our brains are getting used to
Yeah.
these quick hits of information.
And just like switching.
Yeah, constantly switching.
And then when we have to sit down and focus on something.
Yeah, it's harder to
It's hard.
stay engaged.
It's hard.
Yeah.
And the article poses this question directly to the reader. It says, do you find it harder to focus
Yeah.
after spending time scrolling through short videos?
It's a good question to ask yourself.
It is. And I think for me, the answer is yes.
Yeah. You too?
Sometimes.
Yeah, sometimes, definitely.
It depends.
Yeah.
But I've definitely noticed that
It takes a while to kind of reset
my brain.
after being on TikTok for a while. Yeah.
So another really interesting real world example that the article brings up is cancel culture.
Oh, yeah, cancel culture.
So what is cancel culture?
Basically, cancel culture is this idea that if someone does something or says something that is deemed offensive or problematic, then they can be canceled.
Right.
Which basically means that people will stop supporting them.
Yeah, they'll boycott them.
They'll boycott them. They'll unfollow them.
Yeah.
They'll speak out against them online.
It's basically like public shaming.
Public shaming.
Taken to like
At the-
nth degree.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because the article defines boycott as to withdraw support or refuse to engage with something.
Right.
And then it defines public shaming as publicly humiliating someone.
Often online.
Often online.
Yeah.
And this is something that we see happening all the time now.
All done, yeah.
Where it become very common
Like, people's careers can be ruined. Yeah, their reputations can be destroyed
overnight
overnight. Yeah.
because of something they said or did.
And sometimes it's deserved,
Right.
but sometimes it's not.
Right. And that's a whole other conversation.
That's a whole other...
Like, what are the ethics of this?
Yeah.
But it's just interesting to see how online behavior can have these real world consequences.
Absolutely. It's a very real phenomenon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the article also has this really thought-provoking section where it presents like a debate club scenario.
Right.
And the statement that they're debating is social media has done more harm than good to human behavior, which is like the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah, it's the big question.
Is it a net positive or a net negative?
Right.
And so it presents arguments from both sides.
Yeah.
So student A, who agrees with the statement,
Right.
brings up all these points about, the rise in anxiety and depression,
Yeah.
the spread of misinformation,
Yeah.
the potential for reduced attention spans, particularly in young people, all things we've already talked about.
All valid concern.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then student B, who disagrees,
Right.
brings up these other points like social media helps to build global communities.
Yeah.
It can be used to raise awareness for good causes,
Absolutely.
and it allows for greater freedom of expression.
Yeah, you can connect with people
Yeah.
from all over the world.
Right. And so it's like,
Yeah.
okay, it's not all bad.
It's not all good. It's not all bad.
Right. It's nuanced.
It's nuanced, yeah.
It's complex.
It's complex.
And I think that's important to keep in mind as we're having these conversations.
Absolutely, yeah.
So the article ends by talking a little bit about,
About language.
about how we talk about all of this.
Yeah.
And it specifically focuses on this idea of reported speech,
Right.
which is basically how we convey what someone else has said.
Yeah.
And it gives some examples of how to transform direct speech into reported speech. So, for example, like if someone says social media makes me feel inadequate,
Right.
then you could report that by saying she said that social media made her feel inadequate.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because it also talks about how the verb tense often shifts.
You're right.
Like it goes from present tense to past tense.
Yeah.
When you're reporting something that someone else has said. So it's just kind of like a little grammar lesson
Yeah, it's helpful.
tucked in there.
Especially for English language learners.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it also highlights that things like how we communicate about these things.
Yeah.
It's not just our own thoughts and feelings.
To how we convey.
It's also like what other people have said or researched or,
exactly.
concluded about these topics.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's just revisit some of the key takeaways that the article summarizes for us.
Okay.
So it reminds us that social media really influences how we see ourselves and how we see other people.
Right. That whole idea of the curated self.
Yeah, the curated self.
Yeah.
It also has a real impact on our emotional and psychological well-being.
Absolutely.
We talked about social comparison. We talked about addictive behavior.
Yeah, the dopamine.
The dopamine loops, right?
Yeah.
And then it emphasizes how important it is to have this vocabulary that we've been talking about today.
Yeah, words like perception and stimuli.
Authenticity.
Visualization.
Echo chamber.
Yeah. All these words help us to
really unpack and understand.
Articulate what's happening.
Yeah, what's going on.
Yeah.
In a really nuanced way.
Yeah.
So as we're kind of leaving this conversation, I want to leave you with one final thought.
Okay.
So thinking about everything we've just talked about, all the different ways that social media shapes us.
Yeah.
Is there one small change that you could make in your own digital habits to feel a little bit more in control?
Yeah.
And a little bit more connected to what really matters to you?
That's a great question.
Yeah, this isn't about quitting social media altogether.
Right.
It's about how can we navigate it?
More consciously.
More consciously, yeah.
Yep.
So that we're not just being swept away by the current.
Right, being more mindful.
Yeah, being more mindful about how we use it.
Absolutely.
I think that's a great place to end it.
Yeah, I think so too.
All right, thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll see you next time.
See you next time.
Ever really stop to think if you're truly in control of your choices? What if everything you do was set in motion way before you even thought about it?
It's a massive question, right? It gets right to the heart of who we think we are.
Exactly. And that's the puzzle we're diving into today, the debate between free will and determinism.
A bit of a philosophical head-scratcher, yeah, but it's way more than just an abstract idea. I mean, this touches on everything from our sense of responsibility to our legal systems.
Sure.
Our goal here, for you listening, is to get through these really complex ideas without getting bogged down by jargon, look at it from all angles, and really understand how this impacts how we live our lives.
Totally.
And the material we'll be looking at is some fascinating philosophical discussions specifically aimed at advanced English learners, so we'll really get to grips with both the language and the concepts.
Okay, great. So first things first, what are we even talking about when we say free will? What's at the core of it?
Basically, free will is the power to make choices that aren't dictated by, fate or things that happened before. It's the ability to act independently, to make decisions that aren't just the inevitable outcome of what came before.
Gotcha.
Think about that feeling you get when you choose to, say, call a friend or pick one book over another, that sense of, I decided to do this.
Right.
That's the feeling of free will in action. Our source defines it as the power of acting without the constraint of necessity or fate, the ability to act at one's own discretion.
So it really is that internal sense of, I'm making this happen.
Exactly. And a perfect example of this is in this sentence from the source. She believes people have free will and can change their behavior if they really want to.
Yeah, that makes sense. It emphasizes that ability to choose and the accountability that goes along with it.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's free will. What's the opposite view? What does determinism say?
Well, determinism proposes that all events, even our choices, are actually already set by things that have happened in the past, like a chain of cause and effect stretching back forever.
Wow.
And our actions are just links in that chain. Our source defines it as the doctrine that all events, including human action, are ultimately determined by causes external to the will.
So that feeling we have of making a free choice, maybe it's all just an illusion.
Potentially, yeah. Our incredibly complex brains might be creating that feeling, even if it's not reflecting reality.
So even something as simple as what I had for breakfast wasn't really a choice. It was just a series of events that led to that moment.
That's the idea, yeah, a bit radical, I know.
It is. Now, I know the source breaks down determinism into different types too.
Right.
What are those?
Right. There are four main ones to consider. First up is causal determinism. Basically, every single event, without exception, is a direct result of something that happened before it.
Okay, so one thing leads to another, and there's no space for any actions that weren't triggered by something else.
Exactly. It's almost like those dominoes lined up, you knock one over, and the rest fall in a predictable way.
Got it.
Of course, in the real world, it's much more complicated than dominoes. There are feedback loops and things that emerge from the interactions, but the core idea is the same.
Right. That makes sense. What's next?
Then there's theological determinism, which basically says that God is the ultimate cause of everything. So all events, including our choices, are determined by God's will.
So in that view, our life path isn't really up to us. It's already been laid out.
Exactly. It's part of a divine plan. Then we have biological determinism. This is all about our physical makeup, our genes, and biology being the main drivers of our behavior.
Okay, so like our genetics can make us more likely to behave in certain ways. Makes sense.
Yeah, that's the basic idea. Like you might hear about genetic links to specific personality traits or tendencies.
Yeah, for sure. And the last one?
That's psychological determinism. So this one focuses on our mental states, past experiences as the key factors that shape our actions. You know, our thoughts, feelings, our upbringing, all of it.
So it's saying that our past pretty much dictates the choices we make today.
Yeah, essentially that our experiences mold us into who we are, and that dictates how we act.
Okay, so we have all these different flavors of determinism, each suggesting that maybe, just maybe, our sense of freedom isn't what it seems.
Right.
And the source also lays out some key vocab here that's important for this discussion.
Yeah, getting a handle on these terms is going to be super helpful as we navigate this whole free will versus determinism debate.
Absolutely. What's the first one?
So first up is autonomy. It's basically independence, freedom, particularly freedom of the will.
So if you lean towards believing in free will, you probably value personal autonomy in making decisions.
Precisely. Like in this example, the therapist encouraged personal autonomy in decision-making.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it's that feeling of being self-governing, being the ultimate decider in your own choices.
Right. Autonomy. What's next?
Next up is accountability. This one's all about taking responsibility for your actions.
And that ties directly to free will, right? If we genuinely choose our actions, then we should be held accountable for what we do.
Exactly. It's like this example. In a world with free will, accountability is crucial.
Yeah, if our actions are all predetermined, holding someone accountable doesn't make much sense anymore.
That's a really key point. And then we have inevitability, which is basically the state of something being unavoidable.
So the opposite of being able to make a choice. Like it was going to happen no matter what.
Exactly. This example really illustrates that deterministic mindset. He saw failure as an inevitability, not a choice.
Yeah, I see that. It's like giving up control, accepting something was bound to happen. What's next?
All right, so then we have predetermined. This just means decided in advance. Think of it like this example. Some people think our lives are predetermined by fate.
That's a bit of a heavy thought. Like we're just acting out a script that was already written for us.
Yeah. Some people find that idea comforting, others find it unsettling. Then we have conscious deliberation. This is basically thoughtful, intentional decision-making.
So really thinking through your options, considering consequences, we associate that with free will, right?
Absolutely. It definitely feels like we're exercising our free will when we're weighing up options and thinking carefully about a decision. Like in this example, moral choices often require conscious deliberation.
Makes sense. When you're really engaged in that process, the idea that it was all predetermined just feels strange.
For sure. Closely related to that is moral responsibility, which is basically the duty to do what's right and be accountable for your actions.
Which brings us back to the big question.
Yeah.
If we don't have free will, can we really be morally responsible?
Exactly. The source poses this thought. Without free will, can we truly have moral responsibility? And it really does cut to the core of how we view ethics and justice.
Right. If our actions are predetermined, it changes everything about how we think about right and wrong.
Then we have agency, the capacity to act independently to make your own choices.
So that's the feeling that I am in control, that my choices have real impact.
Exactly. But determinism challenges the idea of human agency, as our source points out. So it's a direct conflict between the two concepts.
Yeah, agency is that sense of being an active participant in shaping your own life, not just passively along for the ride.
Precisely. And finally, we have compatibilism, the idea that free will and determinism can actually both exist.
Oh, so a kind of middle ground.
Exactly. It's like trying to build a bridge between these two seemingly opposite ideas. The source describes it like this. Compatibilism tries to reconcile freedom with causality.
Okay, compatibilism. We'll need to explore that more. So now we have a pretty good grasp of the basic concept and vocab, right?
I think so, yeah.
What's next?
Well, the source gets into some really interesting ways of illustrating this whole tension between free will and determinism.
Cool. How do they do that?
One way is through a little dialogue set in a philosophical cafe. There's Anna, who's a big believer in free will, and Mark, who's a bit more skeptical. Anna asks Mark straight out, "Do you believe people truly have free will?"
Okay, to the point.
And Mark responds with, "I'm not sure. It feels like I choose, but what if my choices are just illusions created by my brain's chemistry?"
Ooh, getting right to the heart of it. It's that inner feeling of choice versus the idea that our brains are just super complex machines following physical laws.
Exactly. And then Anna, she brings up a really important point. She asks how we can hold criminals accountable if they don't have free will.
Yeah, that's a big one.
And Mark's response is really interesting. He suggests we should think about punishment as a way to prevent future harm to society rather than as a moral judgment for something they chose to do wrong.
So shifting the focus from punishment to prevention.
Yeah, a more utilitarian view of punishment.
That does change things, yeah. If people aren't really free agents, the whole idea of punishment as retribution starts to break down.
Exactly, but then Anna expresses this really strong personal belief in free will. "I believe in free will because I feel responsible for my actions," she says.
I feel that powerful intuition that we are the authors of our choices. It's a hard feeling to shake off.
It is. And the source then offers up some questions for you, the listener, to think about.
Great. Like what?
Well, first, it asks what Mark might mean by illusions created by my brain's chemistry. What do you make of that?
It makes you think about that materialist view of consciousness, where our thoughts and feelings are ultimately just physical processes happening in the brain.
Right. So maybe that feeling of making a decision is just a story our brain creates after the fact.
Whoa.
Then there's this other question. Do you agree that punishment can be more about prevention than about retribution?
Yeah, that forces you to really think about the purpose of our justice system. If we shift away from the idea that people freely choose to commit crimes, how does that change things?
It's huge, right?
Absolutely.
And finally, it asks how this whole conversation reflects that tension between responsibility and causality, which is the heart of the free will, versus determinism debate.
It really highlights how our beliefs about free will impact how we think about accountability and the reasons behind our actions.
For sure. Then the source goes on to present a couple of thought experiments to try and shed more light on these concepts.
Okay, I love those. What's the first one?
It's called the domino effect, a classic.
Oh yeah, I've heard of that one.
It's a really clear analogy for causal determinism. So imagine a long line of dominoes, and you push the first one over, it knocks over the next one, and the next, and so on, in a predictable chain reaction.
Right.
The question is, if we're essentially like dominoes, with each action being a predictable result of the one before it, can we really make a free decision?
I mean, it does paint a pretty stark picture, right? Like,
Yeah.
if every action is just a predictable outcome of what came before, where's the freedom in that? It feels like we're just programmed to fall in a certain way.
Right. It really underscores that idea of a purely mechanical universe where everything is connected in this rigid chain of cause and effect, leaving seemingly no room for genuine free will.
Okay, I see that.
What about the second thought experiment? Have you heard of the neuroscience debate?
Can't say I have. Fill me in.
Well, this one's particularly interesting because it brings in some modern science. There have been studies that show brain activity related to a decision can be detected even before we're consciously aware of making that decision.
No way. So our brains are making decisions before we even realize it.
That's what the research seems to suggest, yeah. So the big question is, if our brains are deciding before we consciously think, I'm going to do this, are we really the ones making the choice?
That's crazy. It's like our brains are running on autopilot and our conscious mind is just catching up later and thinking it made the call.
It does kind of feel that way, right? And it really challenges that feeling of being in control.
Cool.
And it's because of research like this that the source says the notion of free will is under intense scrutiny, especially since it suggests that our sense of agency might be retroactively constructed.
Okay, that's a lot to unpack. First, notion.
Yeah, so by notion, the source just means an idea or belief. It gives this example. The notion of justice varies from culture to culture. So in our case, the notion of free will is that generally accepted idea that we do in fact have free will.
Makes sense. So what about under intense scrutiny?
That means that it's being looked at closely and critically. Like, his actions were under intense scrutiny after the scandal.
So free will is no longer just a given. People are really questioning it.
Yeah, exactly. And this intense scrutiny is happening in the wake of all this new scientific research.
Right. In the wake of means as a result of, right? Like in the wake of the new laws, companies change their policy.
Exactly. Then we have sense of agency, which is that feeling of being in control of your actions. Like meditation can help restore your sense of agency.
Right. That feeling that I am the one making things happen.
Yes, that's it. And retroactively constructed, the last part, means that it's created after the fact.
So it's like our brains might actually be making the decision first. Then our conscious mind creates this feeling of, I made that choice afterwards.
Exactly. Like the example, the story was retroactively constructed to make sense of random events. Pretty mind-blowing, right?
Totally. It really does challenge everything we think we know about making choices. But I know the source also lays out some arguments in favor of free will despite all this. What are those?
Yeah, so first there's the idea of moral accountability. If we don't really have free will, how can we say someone deserves blame or praise for their actions?
Right. It seems like the whole idea of morality rests on the assumption that people could have chosen to act differently.
Exactly. Then there's the argument of intuition and experience. I mean, we all have that really strong feeling of being free, of making choices.
Yeah, I get that. Even with all the deterministic arguments, it's hard to shake that feeling. What else?
Well, there's the fact that our entire legal system is basically built on the idea of free will.
Oh, that's a huge one. Our whole justice system, guilt, innocence, punishment, it all seems to hinge on this idea of free choice.
Exactly. But of course, there are strong arguments for determinism, too. What do you think some of those might be?
Let's see. Well, there's that basic principle in science. Every event has a cause.
Right, science and causality. Determinists would argue that our thoughts and actions aren't exempt from that. They have causes too, even if they're complex.
Yeah, it makes sense. While quantum physics might show randomness at a very small scale, in our everyday lives, it seems like everything is caused by something.
That's the deterministic view in a nutshell. And then there's the argument based on predictability of behavior.
Oh yeah, like how psychology and data analysis can often predict how people will act.
Exactly. Determinists point to that and say, see, our actions aren't completely free after all.
It's true. Look at how advertisers try to predict what we'll buy, or how social media algorithms try to guess what content we'll like. There are definitely patterns there.
There are, for sure. And then the last major argument for determinism is based on biological constraints. Our genes and upbringing, they undeniably shape our preferences and tendencies.
Right. Our genes might make us more likely to have certain personality traits, and our childhood experiences definitely influence our values and beliefs. It all affects how we make decisions.
Exactly. So determinists argue that all these factors severely limit the scope for truly free will.
Yeah, it starts to feel like the space for pure, unconstrained choice is shrinking. But wait, didn't we mention compatibilism before? How does that fit into all this?
Oh, right. Compatibilism is where things get really interesting. It's a philosophical attempt to say that free will and determinism can actually coexist.
Really? How does that even work?
Well, compatibilists propose that even if our actions are caused by previous events, they can still be considered free if they align with our desires, intentions, and values, as long as there's no external force making us do them.
Okay, so if I choose to have coffee in the morning because I like the taste and the caffeine boost, that's a free choice, even if my love of coffee came from my upbringing.
Exactly. It's about whether you're acting in accordance with your own internal motivations, not being forced by something external.
So even if those internal motivations have roots in past events, the choice is still considered free in that moment?
That's the essence of compatibilism, yeah. It's a really clever attempt to reconcile these two big ideas.
I like it. Now, the source also gives some idiomatic expressions that are relevant to all this, just to make it even more engaging.
Oh yeah, these are common phrases that pop up a lot when discussing these concepts.
What are some of them?
Well, first up is of one's own accord. It just means voluntarily, without being pressured.
Okay, so emphasizing that the action truly came from the person's own will.
Yeah, exactly. Like, he left the company of his own accord.
What's another one?
We have out of your hands. So that means something's beyond your control, you can't influence it.
I get that. Like, some things are simply out of your hands.
Yep, it points to those limits on our agency that determinism often emphasizes. Then there's call the shots. That means to be in control, making the decisions.
Oh yeah, that connects to that feeling of agency we talked about earlier. Like, she likes to call the shots in every project.
Exactly. It's about having the power to choose. Then we have be hardwired to. That means to be naturally inclined to do something because of your biology or psychology.
Right, so like humans are hardwired to seek patterns. That points towards those innate behaviors that might not be a matter of choice.
Right, that's a good example. And last but not least, there's put yourself in someone's shoes.
Oh yeah. That means to imagine what it would be like to be in someone else's situation.
Right. The example is to understand justice, put yourself in the victim's shoes. So it's about empathy, understanding different perspectives, which is super important for these big moral questions we've been talking about.
Absolutely. Now, I know the source goes on to provide a conversation scenario to put all this into practice. What is that all about?
Right. It's a university debate titled, "Are We Truly Free?" with two students arguing opposing sides.
Okay, that sounds interesting.
Student A, who's arguing for free will, starts by saying, "I believe we have agency. Even if my environment influences me, I make the final call."
Yeah, it's about that feeling of having the ultimate decision-making power, even with all the external factors influencing you.
Yeah, exactly. And then student B, arguing for determinism, counters that, saying, that final call may feel free, but it could just be your neurons firing in a certain way, controlled by your genes and everything that's happened to you.
So again, that idea that our brains are making the choices based on pre-existing conditions.
Exactly. But then student A brings up a really interesting point, asking how people can change so dramatically after a trauma or deep reflection if everything is determined.
Right. That idea of personal transformation and breaking free from old patterns really does seem to suggest some degree of freedom.
It does. But of course, student B has a deterministic explanation for that too. They say, even those changes have causes the trauma, the reflection, they trigger new things in the brain, but it's still all cause and effect.
So even the act of choosing to change is itself a determined outcome.
Yep, pretty consistent, right?
Very much so.
And then to get you, the listener, thinking, the source provides some questions for you to consider.
Love those. What are they?
The first one is pretty simple. Whose argument did you find more convincing, student A or student B?
That's a good one. It really makes you think critically about the arguments and decide which one resonates more with you.
Exactly. Then it asks, if determinism is true, can people really change?
Yeah, that's deep. If we're just puppets of causality, does self-improvement even make sense?
Right. It raises questions about the very meaning of change and growth.
It does. What's the last question?
It asks you to think about the role of society in shaping our views on freedom and determinism.
Oh, that's a good one. Our upbringing, the laws, our culture, they all probably influence how we think about these big questions.
Absolutely. So there we have it, a really deep dive into the core concepts of free will and determinism. We've gone through arguments, looked at thought experiments, and even dug into the language we use to talk about all of this.
It's been fascinating, really. I think the biggest takeaway for me is that even if we don't arrive at any definitive answers, engaging with this debate helps us think more clearly and critically about our choices and the things that might be influencing them.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's about being more aware of the complexity of our own actions and decisions.
So here's a final thought for you all out there listening. Think about a recent decision you made, anything, big or small. Did it feel completely free in the moment? Now, thinking about all we've discussed, what factors, conscious or unconscious, might have played a part in that choice? Could that feeling of freedom itself be part of a bigger, determined sequence of events? Or was there truly some element of real autonomy there?
It's a question that's been debated for centuries, and your own reflections on it are a valuable part of that ongoing conversation. Keep thinking, keep exploring, and maybe you'll come to your own conclusions.
Great advice. Thanks for taking this deep dive with me.
My pleasure.
And for everyone listening, until next time, keep questioning, keep thinking, and keep diving deep.
See you next time. Ever think about, like, I don't know, the idea that we might actually be able to reshape, like, the very blueprint of life itself?
Yeah, it's wild, right?
I mean, cloning, it used to be just something out of a sci-fi movie.
Oh, for sure.
But now it feels like we're on the verge of it actually happening.
It really does. And it brings up a lot of, kind of urgent questions.
Absolutely. And that's what we're diving into today.
Okay, sounds good.
The ethical maze, if you will, surrounding human cloning and genetic engineering.
Exactly.
So, In this deep dive, we're going to try to unpack some of these really complex issues.
Yeah, and we've got a fascinating article to guide us.
Right.
It's called The Ethics of Human Cloning and Genetic Engineering.
Okay, great.
And our goal here is to, cut through the noise and try to give you a clearer picture of what's really at stake.
That's a good way to put it.
So we'll start by breaking down some of the key terms, making sure we're all on the same page.
Yeah, that's important.
Then we'll dive into the science, the ethical debates, and even look at some real-world examples that show just how important this all is.
Right. So if you've ever, wondered about what it means to tweak a gene.
Yes.
Or you remember that whole cloned sheep thing?
Jelly, yeah.
Yeah, Dolly, exactly.
Big news.
This is definitely the deep dive for you.
Absolutely.
Okay, so first things first, let's get a grip on some of these essential terms.
Okay, sure.
Cloning. What exactly are we talking about when we say cloning?
Well, at its simplest, cloning is making an exact genetic copy of something, another organism.
Okay.
And the article, it points to Dolly the sheep back in 1996.
I remember that.
That was a huge moment.
It was.
Because it showed us that cloning a complex mammal wasn't just, science fiction anymore. It could actually be done.
Yeah. And then there's genetic engineering, which is a term we hear all the time these days.
Right.
So how is that different from cloning?
So genetic engineering, it's more about actually going in and making changes to an organism's DNA.
Ah, okay.
It's like editing the instructions themselves.
Got it.
So the article gives the example of, inserting a gene into a plant to make it resistant to disease.
Yeah.
See this a lot in agriculture these days.
Right. Okay, so cloning is like hitting copy-paste.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it.
And genetic engineering is more like going in with a really fine tip pen and making specific tweaks.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, the article also keeps mentioning embryos.
Yes.
Why are embryos such a central part of these ethical discussions?
Well, because a lot of the research, both with cloning and genetic engineering, it happens at the embryo stage, right? So this, naturally brings up a lot of ethical questions about how much we should be manipulating these, very early forms of life.
That makes sense. It's sort of the when does life begin question.
Yeah, and the extent of our intervention.
Right, exactly. Now, there's also this term germline editing. And that sounds like it has some serious long-term consequences.
It does.
So explain what that is.
Well, germline editing, it means making changes to the reproductive cells.
Okay.
Like the sperm or the egg.
Okay.
Or to a very early embryo.
Uh-huh.
The big thing here is that those changes, they don't just affect that one individual. They get passed down to all their offspring, future generations.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, it really raises questions about the long-term impact on the entire human gene pool.
Huge implications there. So we're not just making decisions for one person.
Right.
We're talking about potentially changing the genetic inheritance of humanity.
That's right.
That's a pretty big deal. Now, we also often hear about designer babies.
Right.
Which, it almost sounds like something out of a movie.
It does have that kind of, science fiction ring to it.
It does. So what's the basic idea there?
Well, designer babies refer to this idea that, parents could actually choose or even modify, the genetic traits of their children.
Okay.
And often the goal is to choose traits that are, seen as desirable in society.
Yay.
And this, it raises concerns that we could end up in a situation where only certain characteristics are seen as valuable.
Yeah.
And others are, sort of marginalized.
I see, yeah. And then there's this term eugenics, which, has a pretty dark past.
It does, yeah.
So how does that fit into this conversation?
So eugenics is basically the idea that you can improve the human population by selectively breeding for certain traits.
Okay.
And it's crucial to remember that this idea, it's been terribly misused in the past.
Absolutely.
The article, it rightly points to the Nazis.
Right.
They twisted eugenics,
Yeah.
To justify their horrifying racist ideology.
Absolutely.
So yeah, it's a really powerful reminder of the dangers of trying to engineer, some kind of superior race based on biased ideas.
A very dark chapter in human history, for sure. Yeah. And finally, we have the term bioethics.
Okay.
What's the role of bioethics in all of this?
Well, bioethics, it's the field that looks at all the ethical questions that come up from advances in biology and medicine.
So it's like the ethics of messing with life itself.
In a way, yeah. So it's where we grapple with these big questions like, should we be using powerful tools like genetic engineering on humans?
Right.
And if so, how do we do it responsibly?
Yeah. Okay, so we've got our vocabulary down.
Yeah, we've got our toolkit.
Now let's get into the actual science.
Okay.
The article talks about 2 types of human cloning.
Yes.
What are they and what makes them different?
So the 2 types are therapeutic cloning
Okay.
and reproductive cloning.
Right. Okay.
And the main difference is the goal. So with therapeutic cloning, you're making a cloned embryo for medical research.
Okay.
The idea isn't to create a baby.
Got it.
It's to study diseases
Okay.
and, maybe develop new therapies. Whereas reproductive cloning, well, the goal there is to actually create a living being that's genetically identical to the donor.
Okay, so 2 very different goals.
Yeah, very much so.
Now, when we talk about genetic engineering, how does that, technically work?
Right.
The article mentions this thing called CRISPR-Cas9.
Yeah, that's a big one.
What's so special about that?
So CRISPR-Cas9, it's a revolutionary technology.
Okay.
It's made gene editing so much more precise
Right.
and much more accessible. You can think of it like a really high-tech pair of scissors
Okay.
that can go in and target specific bits of DNA.
Oh, wow.
And you can add genes, remove them, repair faulty ones.
So we can actually go in and edit the code of life.
Yeah, in a way.
That's incredible.
It really opens up, a whole world of possibilities.
It sounds like it. So what kind of things could we potentially do with this?
Well, the article suggests that, we could go beyond just fixing problems.
Okay.
We might be able to enhance certain traits,
Oh.
make people stronger, smarter, who knows? But, and this is really important, these possibilities also come with a whole lot of ethical baggage.
Right.
Just because we can do something doesn't mean we should.
Exactly. And that brings us to the really big thorny issue, right? The ethical considerations.
Yeah.
So let's start with maybe the most basic question.
Okay.
Is it morally okay to clone a human being?
That's the big one, isn't it?
It is. So what are some of the main arguments against it?
Well, the article it points out, the concern that cloning would violate a person's individuality, their uniqueness.
Right.
And there's also the worry that it could, lead to the commodification of human life.
Okay.
Like people would be seen as just, products, genetic commodities. And then, some people are concerned about the impact on family structures and, societal norms.
Right. Yeah.
It would definitely shake things up.
It would. But on the other hand, what about the arguments in favor of human cloning?
Sure. What are the potential benefits that people see?
Well, some people argue that it could help infertile couples, have children who are genetically related to them.
Okay.
And there's also the possibility of, using cloning for therapeutic purposes,
Okay.
like growing organs for transplantation
Oh, wow.
that could, potentially save lives.
Yeah.
And then, although it's a lot more controversial, some suggest that cloning could be a way to preserve, exceptional genetic traits.
Oh, like cloning Einstein, for example.
Yeah, that kind of thing. But of course, that raises a whole host of other ethical questions.
Absolutely. We also keep hearing this phrase, playing God.
Oh, yeah, that comes up a lot.
It does.
Yeah.
So what are people afraid of when they say that?
Well, I think the core concern is that, humans are overstepping their boundaries.
Yeah.
We're meddling with the natural order of things.
Right.
And, people worry about unintended consequences.
That we might unleash something we can't control.
But the article also presents a different perspective on that playing God argument, right?
It does, yeah.
What's the counterpoint?
Well, that view often says, look, if we have the ability to ease suffering,
Oh, okay.
if we can improve lives with these technologies, then maybe we have a moral obligation to at least explore them.
I see, yeah.
They argue that, scientific progress is part of what makes us human.
It's in our nature to push boundaries.
Right.
Okay, that's an interesting perspective. Now, another ethical concern that comes up is this idea of social inequality.
Yes, that's a big one.
How could these technologies potentially worsen inequality?
Well, the worry is that genetic enhancement, it could become, a luxury,
Okay.
something only the wealthy can afford.
Right.
And that could create a society where, there's a genetic divide
Oh, wow.
between the haves and the have-nots.
It's like a genetic upper class.
Yeah, and that, it raises really tough questions about fairness.
It does, yeah. Would genetically engineered people be seen as I don't know, superior?
Right.
And how would that impact society?
Yeah, big questions.
And then there's the whole issue of consent.
Right.
Which seems really fundamental when we're talking about altering the genes of future generations.
It is.
So how do we grapple with that ethically?
Well, that's the challenge, isn't it? Because babies who are genetically modified, they can't consent to those changes.
They can't, by definition.
Right. And even if the goal is, to prevent disease or to give them some kind of advantage in life, the question is it okay to make those changes without their permission?
Right.
Without knowing how they might feel about it later on.
Heavy stuff. Okay, the article then moves on to some real-world scenarios.
Yes.
Let's talk about the case of the Chinese CRISPR babies.
Okay.
What happened there?
So, back in 2018, a Chinese scientist, he announced that he'd use CRISPR to edit the genes of twin baby girls.
Wow.
And his goal was to make them resistant to HIV. But this announcement, it caused a huge uproar.
I can imagine.
Yeah, the global scientific community, they condemned it as reckless and unethical. They felt that it was way too early to be doing this kind of experiment on humans.
Right.
And that there were potentially huge risks involved.
Okay. And then there's the use of therapeutic cloning for research on diseases.
Right.
What are the ethical considerations there?
Well, therapeutic cloning, it has this amazing potential.
Yeah.
You could create cells that are genetically matched to a patient.
Oh, wow.
And that would be huge for studying and treating diseases.
Absolutely.
Things like Parkinson's or diabetes.
Right.
But the thing is, it involves creating and then destroying human embryos.
Okay.
Just for research. So it raises this really difficult question. Is it morally okay to create life?
Even for a good cause.
Even at the very earliest stage, even if you never intend to implant it.
Tough one. Now, the article also includes some examples of everyday conversations about these topics.
Yes.
Were there any themes or points that stood out to you in those conversations?
Well, I noticed that, people were really struggling with the uncertainty of it all.
Okay.
Trying to weigh the risks and the potential benefits.
It's a lot to weigh.
It is. And there were also a lot of discussions about, where to draw the line with things like designer babies.
That's a big one.
Yeah. And even some philosophical questions about, would a clone really be the same person as the original?
Yeah.
I mean, it's fascinating to see how these issues really get people thinking.
It shows they're not just abstract ideas.
Right. They're things that could actually impact our lives.
Absolutely. And it's helpful to see how all that vocabulary we talked about earlier is actually used in these conversations, right?
Oh, yeah.
Did any of the example sentences really bring home the complexity of these issues?
Yeah, definitely.
What stood out to you?
Well, seeing terms like reproductive cloning and germline editing, it really drove home the long-term implications.
Yeah.
We're not just talking about individual choices here.
Right.
These decisions could have consequences for generations to come.
Exactly. And the fact that they're already talking about the need for international guidelines on cloning research.
Yes.
It shows just how real this all is, right?
Yeah, it's not just a theoretical debate anymore.
Okay, so the article then gives us some questions to think about.
Okay.
And these are really crucial questions for all of us to ponder.
They are.
Could you share a few of those key themes for reflection?
Sure. So one question is it ever ethically acceptable to alter a person's DNA? And another one is, should parents be allowed to choose their children's traits?
That's a big one.
And how can we make sure that genetic technologies are regulated fairly?
Yeah, that's important.
Does cloning violate human dignity? And what if we could use genetic engineering to make people live to be 150? Would that be a good thing or a bad thing?
So many things to think about.
Right.
And even a little bit about grammar, focusing on modal verbs.
Yeah.
Those words like should, might, could,
Yeah.
they seem really relevant to this discussion.
They are. They're all about possibilities and obligations.
Right.
So when we say something like, we should proceed with caution,
Yeah.
well, that's expressing a moral duty.
Okay.
But when we say germline editing might have unintended consequences,
Right.
that highlights a potential risk. So these words, they help us navigate all the uncertainty around these issues.
They help us think about the ethics.
Exactly.
Okay, and the article ends with a writing prompt, right?
It does, yeah.
About whether we should use genetic engineering to enhance human abilities,
That's a good one.
which is really getting to the heart of what we've been talking about today.
It is. It asks us to really examine our values and decide what we think about all of this.
So it's clear that we're at a really pivotal moment.
Oh, yeah, we are.
The science is moving so fast.
At breakneck speed.
Yeah. And our ethical understanding needs to catch up.
Absolutely, yeah. We can't let the technology get ahead of our values.
Right.
And the article really drives that point home.
It does.
These aren't just scientific questions.
Right.
These are human questions.
About who we are.
Exactly.
And what kind of future we want.
And those final questions that the article poses, they really get you thinking.
Yeah. What kind of world do you want to live in?
Right.
How much control should we have over life?
And who gets to decide what's better, what's perfect?
Big questions.
Huge.
And I think the most thought-provoking idea the article leaves us with is this. Imagine if genetic modifications become normal.
Wow. Yeah.
How would that change how we see ourselves?
That's a profound question.
It is. How would it change our understanding of being human?
I don't know. It's hard to even fathom.
It is, but it's a conversation we need to be having.
Absolutely. And the sooner the better.
Right. Because this is our future we're talking about.
It is.
So thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
And keep those big questions in mind.
Keep thinking about them.
Because they're not going away anytime soon.
And they're only going to get more important.
Absolutely.